In this video, we're gonna talk about the cranial nerves. Mainly, I'm gonna talk about the names of the cranial nerves and the types of nerve fibers they contain, and very broadly, I will talk about what they do, which structures they innervate. Now, this is the brain stem, but remember, first two cranial nerves have their first order neurons outside the cranial cavity. So you can see first two cranial nerves entering the brain stem. So let's look at our first cranial nerve, the olfactory nerve. But also remember that we number cranial nerves from anterior to the posterior based on their entrance or exit from the brain stem. The sensory nerve or the nerve fibers enter the brain. The motor nerves or the motor nerve fibers exit the brain stem. So you know this rule, but even for the sensory nerves, we say exit the brain stem or exit the cranial cavity. But you know that actually we are talking about entrance of the cranial cavity for the sensory nerve fibers and exit for the motor nerve fibers. Anyway, our first cranial nerve, the olfactory nerve, whose first order neurons reside in the olfactory mucosa in the nasal cavity. This is the olfactory bulb, olfactory tract. About olfaction, smell. And its nerve fibers that this olfactory nerve includes is the SVA, special visceral afferent. Now let's put this aside and continue with this model. This is the optic nerve. Look at optic nerve. First, second, and third order neurons for the visual pathways are found in the retina. And the ganglionic cells, their cell bodies in the retina come together and form the optic nerve. This is the optic nerve. We divide retina into a nasal half and the temporal half. Optic nerve fibers originating from the nasal retina take a shape and form the optic chiasm. So this is the optic chiasm. On the posterior lateral end of the optic chiasm, the optic tracts continue. You see, the optic tract. Nerve fibers in the optic tract mostly terminate in the lateral geniculate body, where you have the fourth order neurons of the visual pathways. And from axons of the fourth order neurons in the lateral geniculate body, in it you have the lateral geniculate nucleus, they form the optic radiation, which terminate in the primary visual cortex around the sulcus. Okay, the nerve fibers, type of nerve fibers, optic nerve includes is the SSA, special somatic afferent, or the special somatic sensory, SSS. Now look at this nerve. This is the third cranial nerve. This is motor nerve, purely motor nerve. Remember the olfactory nerve is purely sensory, and the optic nerve is purely sensory. Olfactory nerve enters the cranial cavity through passing the lamina cribrosa of the ethmoid bone. The optic nerve enters the cranial cavity through passing the optic canal. Then this oculomotor nerve. Oculomotor nerve has two nuclei. One is the oculomotor nuclei, which contains GSE neurons, general somatic efferents, this one, and innervates GSE fibers, innervates the most of the extraocular muscles of the eyeball, which are the medial rectus, superior oblique, inferior oblique, and the inferior rectus muscle beside the levator palpebrae superioris muscle. The parasympathetic fibers we have inside oculomotor nerve, those are the GVE fibers whose cell bodies reside in the Edinger vessel nucleus or the accessory oculomotor nucleus. They synapse in the ciliary ganglion, and postganglionic parasympathetics form the the short ciliary nerves which innervate the ciliary muscle and the sphincter pupillae muscle. Then the fourth cranial nerve, which is this one, this nerve here, the trochlear nerve. Trochlear nerve innervates the superior oblique muscle, which rotates the eyeball inferolaterally. We turn our eyeball inferolaterally mostly when we try the cheating exam. So you can call this one nerve of the cheating. Well, and this is the only nerve exiting brain stem from its dorsal aspect and also decussating before its emergence from the brain stem. Then we have the fifth cranial nerve, the trigeminal nerve, has a large sensory root, a small motor root. The sensory root innervates most of the face, and the motor root innervates the muscles of mastication, anterior belly of digastric muscle, mylohyoid muscle, tensor villi, tensor tympani, and tensor villi palatine muscle. Now let's look at the abducens nerve. Abducens nerve, which is also purely motor nerve, contains GSE fibers, innervates the lateral rectus muscle of the eyeball. So abducts the eyeball. That's why this nerve is called abducens, because it abducts the eyeball. Laterally rotates the eyeball. Let me remind you something with this oculomotor nerve. Remember, right after its exit from the brain stem, the oculomotor nerve passes between the posterior cerebral artery and superior cerebellar artery. That's an important point, especially in clinics, because aneurysms of one of those vessels can impeach the oculomotor nerve and cause its clinics to show up. Then we have the facial nerve here. The facial nerve contains SVA fibers, GSA fibers, SVE fibers, and GVE fibers. Now, the SVA fibers carries taste sensation from anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Its GSA fibers innervates the auriculae and the external ear canal or the external acoustic meatus. So it receives general GSA innervation from the auricula and the external acoustic meatus. Then the GVE fibers are the preganglionic parasympathetics whose cell bodies are found in the superior salivary nucleus. They synapse in pre-pterygopalatine ganglion, which then innervates the lacrimal glands, palatine glands, and the nasal glands. Those synapsing in the submandibular ganglion innervates the sublingual and submandibular glands. Now, the SVE fibers inside the facial nerve innervates the muscles of facial expression and posterior belly of the digastric muscle, stapedius muscle, and stylohyoid muscle. And another thing I like to remind you here that other than SVE fibers, in other words, the SVA, GSA, and GVE fibers form the intermediate nerve. Okay? Now let's talk about the vestibulocochlear nerve. Vestibulocochlear nerve is purely sensory nerve, and it enters the cranial cavity through the internal acoustic meatus. Or you can say that exits the cranial cavity through the internal acoustic meatus along with the facial nerve. So the facial nerve and the vestibulocochlear nerve exits cranial cavity through the internal acoustic meatus. Abducens nerve exits from the cranial cavity through the superior orbital fissure. This trochlear nerve, oculomotor nerve, also exit the cranial cavity through the superior orbital fissure. But for the trigeminal nerve, we have a different story. This trigeminal nerve has three branches. The first one is the ophthalmic nerve, exits cranial cavity through the superior orbital fissure, maxillary nerve through the foramen rotundum, mandibular nerve through the oval foramen ovale. Okay, now let's talk about this vestibulocochlear nerve. Well, cell bodies of the vestibulocochlear nerve found in two ganglia, which are the vestibular ganglia for the vestibular part of the vestibulocochlear nerve, and in the cochlear ganglion for the cochlear part of the vestibulocochlear nerve. The cochlear nerve is about hearing, audition. The vestibular nerve is about balance, equilibration. Then let's look at, so this vestibulocochlear nerve includes SA type nerve fibers. Now let's look at this one. The glossopharyngeal nerve and the vagus nerve contains the highest number of different sensory nerve fibers. And these two nerves contains the same types of nerve fibers. Of course, they innervate different sites in the body. Let's talk about the glossopharyngeal nerve, which contains 5 different nerve fibers, which include the SVA, GSA, GVA, SVE, and the GVE. Same also is applied to the vagus nerve. The SVA fibers for the glossopharyngeal nerve receives taste sensation from posterior 1/3 of the tongue. And glossopharyngeal nerve GSA fibers receives GSA information from the tympanic membrane and the external auditory meatus. Its GVA fibers receives information regarding blood pressure and blood chemical composition about carbon dioxide and oxygen from the carotid sinus and carotid body. And the SVE fibers innervates the palatal stylopharyngeus muscle. And the GVE fibers innervates the parotid gland. Let's look at the vagus nerve here. The vagus nerve has also SVA, GSA, GVA, SVE, and GVE fibers. The SVA fibers receives taste sensation from the root of the tongue around the epiglottic region and around the beginning of the esophagus. And GSA fibers receive or innervates the external acoustic meatus and the auriculae. The GVA fibers receive information regarding blood pressure and the chemical composition of the blood from the aortic sinus and the aortic body. Then the GSVE fibers innervates the paladoglossus muscle, also laryngeal muscles. GVE fibers supply parasympathetic innervation to entire organs in the thoracic cavity and in the digestive tract down to distal 1/3 of the transverse colon. Here is the accessory nerve, also purely motor nerve, innervates the trapezius muscle and the sternocleidomastoideus muscle. The 12th cranial nerve is the hypoglossal nerve. Remember, hypoglossal nerve innervates the muscles containing the word glossal, except the paladoglossal muscle, which is innervated by the vagus nerve.